The gentle waves of the Boston harbor lapped against wooden hulls as moonlight illuminated 3 ships on December 16, 1773. The silence of night was broken by shouts and the splash of wooden crates hitting water. These weren't just any crates. They contained tea from the British East India Company, and their destruction marked one of history's most famous acts of economic defiance. The Boston Tea Party wasn't merely a political protest. It was an early battle in what we now recognize as trade warfare. Trade wars, the strategic use of economic policies to protect domestic industries and pressure foreign nations, have shaped our world in profound ways that often go unrecognized. They've toppled empires, sparked revolutions, and redrawn the map of global power. Today, we'll journey through the dramatic history of these economic conflicts and explore how they continue to influence our world. The concept of trade wars may seem modern, but economic conflict is as old as commerce itself. Ancient civilizations from Rome to China understood that controlling trade routes meant controlling wealth and power. The Phoenicians dominated Mediterranean shipping lanes as early as 1500 BCE, while the famous Silk Road became a battleground of tariffs and trade restrictions long before the modern nation-state emerged. But to understand trade wars properly, we need to grasp the theories that fuel them. In 1776, as American colonists were declaring independence, Scottish economist Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, advocating for free trade and arguing that specialization and exchange benefit all parties. Smith said, "We don't get our dinner from the kindness of the butcher, brewer, or baker, but from their own interests." This revolutionary idea suggested that self-interest in free markets could benefit society as a whole. Yet, just 40 years later, German economist Friedrich List challenged Smith's ideas, arguing that developing nations needed protection from established industrial powers. In his 1841 work, The National System of Political Economy, List asserted, "The power of producing wealth is infinitely more important than wealth itself." List believed that emerging economies needed tariff barriers to develop their own industries before they could compete globally, a concept that would influence economic nationalism for generations. The 19th century witnessed one of history's most consequential trade conflicts, the Opium Wars between Britain and China. The British East India Company faced a severe trade imbalance. British consumers had developed an insatiable appetite for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, but China showed little interest in British goods. To balance this trade deficit, Britain began exporting opium from its Indian colonies to China, creating a devastating addiction crisis. When Chinese officials attempted to stop the opium trade in 1839, seizing and destroying 20,000 chests of opium in Canton Harbor, Britain responded with military force. As Commissioner Lin Zexu, who led the anti-opium campaign, wrote in a letter to Queen Victoria, "Suppose there were people from another country who carried opium for sale to England and seduced your people into buying and smoking it. Certainly your honorable ruler would deeply hate it." The resulting conflict led to China's defeat, forcing open its markets and beginning what Chinese historians call the Century of Humiliation. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, another trade war was brewing that would have even more dramatic consequences. In the early American Republic, the industrializing North favored high tariffs to protect its nascent industries from British competition, while the agricultural South, dependent on cotton exports, favored free trade. This economic tension exacerbated regional divisions that would eventually lead to the Civil War. The Tariff of 1828, nicknamed the Tariff of Abominations by its Southern opponents, imposed taxes as high as 62% on imported goods. South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun condemned it as unconstitutional, oppressive, and unjust, while Northern manufacturers like Pennsylvania's Henry Baldwin celebrated it as necessary protection for American industry. These competing visions of America's economic future contributed significantly to the sectional tensions that erupted into war in 1861. The late 19th century saw the rise of global trade networks on an unprecedented scale, facilitated by steamships, railroads, and the telegraph. This first era of globalization, however, was also marked by fierce economic competition between imperial powers. Germany, a later rival to industrialization, employed protective tariffs under Chancellor Otto von Bismarck to build its manufacturing base, directly challenging British industrial supremacy. By the early 20th century, economic nationalism had reached new heights. World War I shattered the integrated global economy, and the peace that followed did little to rebuild it. The United States, emerging as the world's leading economic power, passed the Fordney-McCumber tariff in 1922, raising import duties to historic highs. When the stock market crashed in 1929, nations responded by raising trade barriers even higher in a desperate attempt to protect domestic jobs. The most notorious of these measures was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which raised U.S. tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods to record levels. As economist Thomas Sowell noted, the Smoot-Hawley tariff was more than an economic disaster. It was a political disaster that generated international ill will. The act prompted immediate retaliation from America's trading partners. Canada increased tariffs on 16 American products that had previously accounted for 30% of U.S. exports to Canada. European nations followed suit, and global trade plummeted by 66% between 1929 and 1934. The tariff war of the 1930s deepened and prolonged the Great Depression. U.S. imports fell from $4.4 billion in 1929 to $1.3 billion in 1932, while exports fell from $5.4 billion to $1.6 billion over the same period. Unemployment soared worldwide, contributing to political instability that would help fuel the rise of fascism in Europe. As British economist Joan Robinson observed, "Even if your trading partner throws rocks into his harbor, that is no reason to throw rocks into your own." After World War II, the victorious Allies sought to prevent such destructive economic nationalism. At the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, they established institutions like the International Monetary Fund and what would later become the World Trade Organization to promote open markets and prevent trade wars. U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, who had witnessed the devastation of the interwar tariff battles, declared, "Unhampered trade dovetailed with peace. High tariffs, trade barriers, and unfair economic competition with war." The post-war period saw unprecedented growth in international trade, with global exports expanding from $61 billion in 1950 to $7.1 trillion by 2000. This explosion in commerce helped fuel the economic miracles in countries like Japan, South Korea, and later China, lifting billions out of poverty.
Do you like to dig deeper? Political economy is full of powerful ideas. You're right in the thick of it. Insightful, thought-provoking, expanding every step of the way. From Adam Smith and the rise of capitalism to Marx's bold critique, mercantilism, Keynesian economics, neoliberalism, and more. Or we explore it all, clearly and from every angle. Keep the momentum going. Check the links, dive deeper, and subscribe for more.
Yet, beneath this surface of growing prosperity, trade tensions continued to simmer. In the 1980s, Japan's export success in industries like automobiles and electronics triggered alarm in the United States. The Reagan administration pressured Japan to accept voluntary export restraints on cars and other products. Meanwhile, American officials accused Japan of unfair practices, including currency manipulation and closed markets. The conflict reached its peak when Congress passed the Trade Act of 1988, which included the infamous Super 301 provision, allowing the U.S. to identify unfair trading partners and impose unilateral sanctions. This aggressive approach succeeded in forcing Japan to open some markets, but at the cost of significant diplomatic friction. As MIT economist Lester Thurow warned at the time, the U.S.-Japan trade war could easily spin out of control. The end of the Cold War and China's emergence as an economic powerhouse created new trade dynamics. China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001 was hailed as a triumph of economic liberalization that would integrate the country into the rules-based trading system. U.S. President Bill Clinton declared, "This agreement is a good deal for America. Our products will gain better access to China's market and every sector from agriculture to telecommunications to automobiles." Within a decade, however, the optimism had faded. China's trade surplus with the United States ballooned from $83 billion in 2001 to $375 billion by 2017. American manufacturers complained of intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers, and state subsidies giving Chinese companies unfair advantages. Workers in industrial regions watched as factories closed and jobs moved overseas, fueling economic anxiety and political discontent. These tensions erupted into a full-scale trade war in 2018 when the U.S. imposed tariffs on $34 billion of Chinese goods, citing unfair trade practices. China immediately retaliated with equivalent tariffs on American products, particularly targeting agricultural exports from politically sensitive states. The conflict quickly escalated, with both sides imposing additional tariffs worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The U.S.-China trade war demonstrated how economic conflicts in the 21st century differ from earlier eras. Supply chains now span multiple countries, making it difficult to target one nation without affecting others. When the U.S. imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum imports in 2018, they hit not just strategic competitors, but also close allies like Canada and the European Union, straining vital diplomatic relationships. Moreover, modern trade wars involve more than just tariffs. They encompass restrictions on investment, technology transfers, and intellectual property, what some analysts have called the weaponization of interdependence. When the U.S. restricted exports of advanced semiconductor technology to China in 2022, it wasn't just protecting domestic industries, but attempting to maintain technological supremacy in a strategic domain. The economic impact of recent trade conflicts has been substantial. Studies suggest that the U.S.-China trade war reduced U.S. GDP by 0.3% and eliminated approximately 300,000 American jobs by 2019. Chinese exports to the U.S. fell by roughly 25% between 2018 and 2019. Perhaps most tellingly, the anticipated benefits, a revival of American manufacturing, and reduction in the trade deficit, largely failed to materialize. Harvard economist Danny Roderick offers a nuanced perspective on these conflicts, noting, "Trade creates winners and losers, and the losers are often more concentrated and visible than the winners. While consumers may benefit from lower prices and greater variety, workers in affected industries experience very real pain, creating political pressure for protectionist measures." The COVID-19 pandemic revealed another dimension of trade conflicts, the vulnerability of global supply chains to disruption. When countries found themselves competing for personal protective equipment and later vaccines, many questioned the wisdom of relying on foreign suppliers for essential goods. The concept of economic security gained new urgency, with calls for reshoring or friend-shoring critical industries. The trade policy landscape saw dramatic shifts with the trade policies implemented during Donald Trump's first presidency from 2017 to 2021, and these approaches have continued following his re-election in 2024. In January 2017, one of Trump's first executive actions was to withdraw the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, signaling a decisive break from decades of American trade liberalization. This was quickly followed by the renegotiation of NAFTA into the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, which included stricter rules of origin for automobiles and improved labor provisions. But it was the sweeping tariffs that truly marked a new era in American trade policy. Using Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, the administration imposed 25% tariffs on steel and 10% on aluminum imports in March 2018, citing national security concerns. These measures affected not just strategic competitors but close allies like Canada, the European Union, and Japan. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called the tariffs insulting and unacceptable, while then European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker declared them protectionism, pure and simple. The administration also deployed Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 to impose tariffs on Chinese goods worth hundreds of billions of dollars. By September 2019, nearly two-thirds of Chinese imports faced tariffs averaging 21%, up from just 3% before the trade war began. China retaliated with equivalent measures targeting American agricultural exports, particularly soybeans, which saw exports to China fall by over 70% in 2018 compared to the previous year. The economic impacts of these policies were mixed. A 2021 study by Moody's Analytics estimated that the trade war with China cost the United States roughly 300,000 jobs and 0.3% of real GDP. American companies bore approximately 93% of the tariff costs, contrary to claims that China would pay for them. Farmers, particularly hard hit by retaliatory measures, received government subsidies exceeding $28 billion between 2018 and 2020 to offset their losses. Some manufacturing sectors did see modest gains. The aluminum industry added approximately 1,500 jobs following the tariffs, while steel producers experienced temporary price increases that boosted short-term profitability. However, downstream industries that use these materials as inputs, like auto manufacturing and construction, faced higher costs that offset many of these gains. Following Trump's return to office in 2025, his administration has doubled down on this protectionist approach with what analysts have dubbed Trump Trade 2.0. The administration has proposed a universal baseline tariff on imports, representing a significant potential shift in U.S. trade policy. Initial announcements have suggested tariffs ranging from 10 to 20% on all imports and potentially higher rates specifically targeting Chinese goods. What distinguishes the current trade situation from historical precedents is its remarkable volatility and unpredictability. The administration has rapidly adjusted tariff proposals and implementation timelines, creating significant uncertainty for businesses and trading partners alike. In one notable instance in early 2025, tariff rates on Chinese electronics were announced, modified 3 times within a 2-week period, then temporarily suspended pending negotiations, only to be reinstated at a different rate shortly thereafter. This unpredictability has complicated economic forecasting and business planning. As Harvard economist Jason Furman noted in March 2025, the economic impact of tariffs depends not just on their magnitude, but on their predictability. When businesses cannot reliably forecast import costs 3 months ahead, investment decisions freeze and supply chains become significantly more expensive to maintain. As we look to the future, the unfolding U.S.-China trade conflict appears increasingly complex and unpredictable. The rapid shifts in tariff policies have created a dynamic where diplomatic negotiations occur simultaneously with escalating trade barriers. Chinese officials have responded with a measured but firm approach, implementing retaliatory tariffs while keeping channels for negotiation open. As Chinese Commerce Minister Wang Wentao stated in April 2025, China seeks cooperative economic relations, but we will not hesitate to protect our interests when faced with unilateral actions. The unpredictability extends beyond just tariff rates. Export controls on advanced technologies, investment restrictions, and potential currency measures remain additional levers that both sides could pull, creating multiple fronts in this economic confrontation. The technology sector has been particularly affected, with semiconductor companies reporting significant challenges in navigating the shifting regulatory landscape. Economists are notably cautious about making definitive predictions given this volatility. Manufacturing employment data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics showed that the previous round of tariffs produced mixed results, with modest job gains in directly protected sectors, approximately 3,000 in steel and 1,400 in aluminum, but job losses in downstream industries that use these materials as inputs. Agricultural exports were particularly hard hit during the previous trade war, with soybean exports to China falling from $12.2 billion in 2017 to $3.1 billion in 2018, according to the USDA, though they partially recovered in subsequent years. Geopolitically, these trade actions have accelerated discussions about the fragmentation of the global economy into competing blocs. The friend-shoring trend has intensified, with nations increasingly evaluating trade relationships based on strategic alignment rather than purely economic considerations. Meanwhile, the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism, already weakened by previous U.S. actions blocking appointments to its appellate body, faces substantial challenges as major economies increasingly pursue bilateral negotiations or unilateral trade remedies. What makes the current situation particularly consequential is that it occurs during a period of significant technological transition. The race for dominance in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and biotechnology has become intertwined with trade policy, creating what political economist Mark Blyth calls the securitization of trade, where economic policy becomes inseparable from national security concerns. Climate change introduces additional tensions to this complex picture, as countries develop carbon border adjustment mechanisms that effectively tax imports from nations with less stringent environmental regulations. Digital trade presents unprecedented challenges as well, with disagreements over data localization, privacy standards, and technology regulation creating new frontiers for trade conflicts. The lessons of history suggest several important insights about trade wars. First, they rarely achieve their stated economic objectives. The Smoot-Hawley tariffs didn't save American jobs, they contributed to a global depression. Second, they frequently spiral beyond control, as trading partners retaliate and conflicts escalate. Finally, economic nationalism often blinds policymakers to the interconnected nature of the global economy, where harming trading partners ultimately harms oneself. Yet trade is never just about economics. It reflects deeper political values and power dynamics. As political scientist Abraham Newman argues, economic globalization has created new vulnerabilities that can be exploited for strategic advantage. In an increasingly multipolar world, trade policy will remain a primary battleground for influence and security. From the Boston Harbor to modern container ports, from the opium wars to semiconductor restrictions, trade conflicts have continuously shaped our world. By understanding their complex history and mixed legacy, we can better navigate the economic tensions that will inevitably define our future, hopefully choosing cooperation over conflict and prosperity over protectionism.
We've got some amazing content coming your way. Subscribe now so you're first in line for fresh insights and all the good stuff you won't want to miss.